I used to think that my home was a fortress, a place where the world couldn't reach me once I turned the deadbolt and slid the security chain into place. It is a strange thing how much we trust a thin piece of metal to keep out the monsters of the world. It was a Tuesday night, and the rain was drumming a steady, hypnotic rhythm against the glass of my bedroom window, creating a wall of sound that made the rest of the neighborhood feel miles away. I was sitting on my bed, scrolling through my phone and enjoying the silence of being home alone, when I heard a sound that didn't belong to the storm. It wasn't the sound of a window breaking or a door being kicked in, which is what you always expect in the movies. No, this was the unmistakable metallic click of a key sliding perfectly into the lock of my front door. My breath hitched in my throat, and I felt a cold surge of adrenaline dump into my bloodstream, making my fingertips tingle with a numb, electric fear. I froze, listening with every fiber of my being, hoping that I had imagined it, or that perhaps it was just the house settling in the cold rain. But then came the second sound, the heavy thud of the deadbolt being retracted, followed by the soft, rhythmic creak of the hinges as the heavy oak door swung open. Someone wasn't breaking into my house. They were simply walking in as if they owned the place. I stayed perfectly still, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, and I realized with a sickening jolt that I hadn't put the security chain on that evening. I had been carrying groceries in, and in my rush to get out of the damp air, I had simply turned the key and walked away. I crept to my bedroom door and cracked it just a fraction of an inch, peering out into the darkened hallway that led toward the living room. My eyes adjusted to the gloom, and I saw a flashlight beam cut through the darkness, dancing across my family photos and my bookshelf with a terrifying familiarity. "This is the one?" a voice whispered, and the sound of it made my skin crawl because it was so calm, so professional, and so utterly devoid of any hesitation. "See the crown molding? You don't find craftsmanship like this in the newer builds. And the floor plan is completely open, perfect for a quick exit if things get messy." I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as I heard a second voice grunt in agreement, the sound of heavy boots echoing on my hardwood floors. They weren't burglars looking for a television or a laptop. They were talking about my home as if it were a product on a showroom floor. I realized then that my landlord, a man I had only met once and who had seemed far too interested in my work schedule, must have sold my keys or the access to my life to someone much more dangerous. "What about the tenant?" the second voice asked, and I heard the sound of a kitchen drawer being opened, the metallic jingle of my silverware being shifted around. The listing said the unit would be vacant by the time the viewing started. The first man laughed, a short, dry sound that lacked any humor. "The tenant is an oversight that will be corrected shortly. We are here for the bones of the house, and anything else inside is just a bonus for the buyers. Check the bedrooms. I want to make sure the structural integrity of the upper floor is worth the asking price." I backed away from the door, my mind racing through every possible escape route, but I knew the only way out was through that hallway. I looked at my window, but the drop to the concrete patio below was 20 feet, and the old wood was swollen shut from the humidity of the storm. I was trapped in a box that I paid rent for, while two men decided my fate in the next room. I looked around my room for a weapon, but all I had was a heavy glass lamp and a small pocket knife I used for opening packages. I heard their footsteps getting closer, the slow, deliberate pace of people who knew they weren't being watched. I ducked into my walk-in closet, pulling the slatted doors shut and burying myself behind my heavy winter coats. I tried to slow my breathing, terrified that the loud, ragged gasps of my own lungs would give me away. Through the slats of the closet door, I watched as my bedroom door pushed open, and the bright, clinical beam of a high-powered flashlight swept across my bed. "Nice and tidy," the man said, and I could see his silhouette now. He was wearing a dark suit, looking more like a businessman than a criminal, which somehow made the situation 10 times more terrifying. He walked over to my nightstand and picked up my watch, turning it over in his gloved hands before tossing it back down with a look of disdain. The previous owner had better taste. "Let's check the bathroom for leaks. I don't want the buyers complaining about water damage in the foundation." He walked into my ensuite bathroom, just inches from where I was crouching in the dark. I could hear him turning on the faucets, testing the water pressure, acting as though I wasn't even a factor in his reality. I realized then that they weren't just thieves. They were part of something much larger, a dark market where people's lives and homes were traded like commodities. "Hey, come look at this," the second man called out from the living room, his voice filled with a strange excitement. The man in the suit left my bathroom and headed back toward the hall, leaving my bedroom door wide open. I knew this was my only chance, a small window of time where their attention was diverted by whatever they had found in my kitchen. I slid out of the closet, my socks sliding silently on the floor, and I crept toward the hallway. As I reached the edge of the doorframe, I looked toward the kitchen and saw them standing over my floor safe, which I had hidden under a decorative rug. They had already cut through the rug, and the second man was holding a thermal imaging device against the metal door of the safe. "He's got a lot of history in here," the man with the device said, his face illuminated by the blue glow of the screen. "Birth certificates, passports, maybe some jewelry. It'll be a nice little commission for the crew." I didn't wait to hear the rest. I turned and bolted for the front door, not caring about the noise anymore. I heard a shout of surprise behind me, the sound of a heavy chair being knocked over as they realized the oversight was making a run for it. I reached the front door, yanked it open, and threw myself out into the freezing rain, my feet hitting the wet grass with a dull thud. I didn't head for the street. I knew they would expect that. Instead, I scrambled over the side fence into my neighbor's yard, clawing my way through the thick hedge of thorns that tore at my skin and my clothes. I didn't stop until I reached the back door of Mrs. Gable's house, an elderly woman who I knew kept a loaded shotgun by her bed for protection. I hammered on her door with everything I had, screaming for her to call the police, my voice cracking with the sheer force of my terror. Lights flickered on in her house, and a few seconds later, the porch light flooded the yard with a yellow, protective glow. I looked back at my own house and saw the two men standing on my porch, their faces hidden in the shadows of their hoods. They watched me for a long heartbeat, and for a second, I thought they might come for me anyway, even with the neighbors watching. But then, the sound of a distant siren began to wail, cutting through the noise of the rain, and the men turned in unison, disappearing back into my house to exit through the rear. When the police arrived 10 minutes later, the house was empty. The front door was standing wide open, the rain misting into my hallway and soaking the rug where they had tried to break into my safe. They hadn't taken the television or the laptop, or even the watch on my nightstand. All they had taken was the spare key from my kitchen hook and a single photograph of me from the hallway wall. The police told me it was likely a professional scouting team, people who find houses that are easy to access and sell the information to higher-level burglary rings. But I knew it was worse than that. I knew by the way they spoke that they weren't looking for my things. They were looking at the space I occupied as if I were already gone. I moved out the very next day, leaving behind most of my furniture and anything that wouldn't fit in my car. I live in a high-rise apartment now with 3 different security checkpoints and a 24-hour doorman. But every night before I go to sleep, I still find myself standing by the door, listening for the sound of a key sliding into a lock that shouldn't belong to anyone but me. I was sitting in my kitchen eating a late dinner when the flashing lights first hit the blinds, casting rhythmic strobes of red and blue across my half-empty plate. My first thought was that there had been a car accident on our quiet suburban street, but when I looked out the window, I saw a white van with an official-looking seal on the side parked haphazardly across my driveway. A man was already halfway up my walkway, dressed in a bright high-visibility vest over a dark tactical jacket, carrying a heavy-duty radio that was crackling with the distorted sound of police chatter. He didn't ring the doorbell. He pounded on the wood with the side of his fist, a heavy, authoritative sound that made the glass panes in the door rattle in their frames. "Emergency services. Open up, you need to evacuate immediately," he shouted, his voice carrying a tone of practiced urgency that sent a cold spike of panic straight through my chest. I pulled the door open just a few inches, leaving the security chain engaged, and I saw a man in his late 30s with a stern, sweat-beaded face looking back at me. He held up a laminated badge so quickly I couldn't read the text, but the bold letters "Official" were printed across the top in a deep, commanding red. He told me there had been a major gas main rupture 2 blocks over, and that the sensors were picking up lethal levels of methane drifting toward my specific property line. He said that if I didn't leave right now, I would be unconscious within 20 minutes, and that the entire block was being cleared out by a special task force. I reached for my keys on the counter, my hands shaking so violently I almost knocked over a vase of flowers, but as I turned back to the door, something felt wrong. I looked past the man toward his van, and I noticed that while the lights on top were flashing, they weren't the high-intensity LEDs that the city police or the fire department used. They looked like cheap plastic strobes suction cupped to the roof. My eyes drifted down to the license plate of the van, and I realized it was covered in a thick layer of wet mud, despite the fact that it hadn't rained in our city for 3 days. "Sir, I just need to grab my cat and my phone. Please give me 1 minute," I said, trying to keep my voice from cracking as I slowly backed away from the door. The man's demeanor changed instantly, the fake professional smile vanishing and being replaced by a look of predatory frustration that made my blood run cold. "There is no time for the animal. The levels are rising too fast and you are obstructing a mandatory evacuation order," he barked, and he leaned his shoulder against the door, testing the strength of the small metal chain that was the only thing standing between him and my living room. I didn't answer him. Instead, I backed into the kitchen and grabbed my phone, ducking below the level of the window so he couldn't see my movements. I dialed 911, my heart thudding so loudly in my ears that I could barely hear the dial tone. And when the operator answered, I whispered my address and asked if there was a gas leak evacuation in progress. "Negative, caller. We have no reports of any utility emergencies or police activity in your area," the operator said, her voice calm and clinical, which only made the reality of my situation feel more like a waking nightmare. "Please stay on the line. We are dispatching officers to your location for a suspicious person report. Do not open your door." As she spoke, I heard a metallic snap from the front of the house. The man had used a crowbar or a heavy tool to shear the security chain right off the wall, and the sound of the front door hitting the interior baseboard echoed through the house like a gunshot. I didn't scream. I knew that if I made a sound, he would know exactly where I was hiding in the open concept floor plan. I slid into the pantry, pulling the heavy wooden door shut and squeezing myself between the shelves of canned goods and dry pasta, my breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps. I heard his boots on the hardwood, slow and deliberate, no longer pretending to be a man in a hurry to save a life. He was whistling a low, tuneless melody that made my skin crawl, the sound of someone who was enjoying the hunt far more than the prize. "I know you're still in here, and I know you aren't on the phone with anyone because I have a signal jammer in my pocket," he lied, his voice echoing through the kitchen just inches away from my hiding spot. I looked at my phone and saw that he was right. The call had dropped, and the signal bars had been replaced by a pulsing, searching icon that felt like a death sentence. I was truly alone, trapped in a wooden box while a man who had planned this for weeks moved through my home. I reached out in the dark and felt the handle of a heavy cast iron skillet that I had stored on the floor of the pantry. It wasn't a gun, and it wasn't a knife, but it was heavy, and it was all I had. I heard him stop directly in front of the pantry door, and for a second, the world went completely silent except for the sound of my own pulse thumping in my temples. I saw the shadow of his boots break the sliver of light at the bottom of the door, and I gripped the handle of the skillet with both hands, bracing my feet against the back wall. "Found you," he whispered, and the door began to creak open. I didn't wait for him to see me. I lunged forward with every ounce of strength I had, swinging the heavy iron pan in a wide, desperate arc toward the height of his head. The metal connected with his temple with a sickening thud, and he let out a muffled groan as he stumbled back into the kitchen island, his official radio falling to the floor and shattering into pieces. He wasn't unconscious, but he was dazed, blood beginning to leak from a gash on his forehead that stood out starkly against his pale, shocked face. I didn't stay to finish the fight. I bolted past him, my feet skidding on the tile as I raced toward the back sliding glass door. I didn't bother unlocking it. I grabbed a heavy decorative chair from the dining table and shattered the glass, the shards cutting my arms as I dove through the opening and into the darkness of the backyard. I ran toward the fence, scaling the wooden slats with an agility I didn't know I possessed, and I didn't stop until I saw the real blue and red lights of a police cruiser turning onto the far end of the street. I stood in the middle of the road, waving my bloody arms and screaming until the patrol car screeched to a halt in front of me. The officers jumped out, their real badges gleaming under the streetlights, and I pointed toward my house, unable to find the words to explain that the man inside was still wearing a vest that promised safety. They caught him in the backyard, trying to climb the same fence I had just cleared. When they searched his van, they didn't find gas sensors or emergency equipment. They found rolls of duct tape, heavy-duty zip ties, and a notebook that contained my daily schedule for the last 3 weeks, including the exact time I usually sat down for dinner. The gas leak was a lie, the badge was a piece of printed cardboard, and the police chatter was just a recorded loop on a hidden speaker. He had used the one thing he knew people wouldn't question, an official uniform, to get me to lower my guard. Now, every time I see a flashing light or hear a knock from someone in a uniform, I don't head for the door. I head for the phone, and I don't open the lock until I've confirmed that the person on my porch is actually there to save me and not to take me away. I have always been a bit of a perfectionist, the kind of person who can't sleep if there is a single dirty dish in the sink or a layer of dust on the baseboards. Because of my busy work schedule, I decided to treat myself to a professional deep clean service, something I had saved up for over the last 3 months. I had seen their flyer on my doorstep, a professional-looking card with a bright blue logo that promised a spotless home while you rest. I called the number, booked a Tuesday evening appointment, and looked forward to the smell of lemon polish and fresh linens. But the moment the 2 men stepped through my front door, the air in my living room seemed to grow heavy, as if the oxygen had suddenly been sucked out of the house. They weren't wearing the bright blue uniforms from the flyer. Instead, they wore dark, stained coveralls that looked like they had been lived in for weeks. They didn't bring a vacuum or a mop, only 2 heavy, battered duffel bags that clattered with the sound of heavy metal as they dropped them onto my hardwood floor. "The supplies are in the bags," the taller one said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that didn't match the polite tone of the person I had spoken to on the phone. He didn't look me in the eye. Instead, his gaze was darting around the room, landing on my electronics, my artwork, and finally, the small floor safe tucked away in the corner of my home office. "I thought the service started with the kitchen," I said, my voice sounding small and uncertain even to my own ears. I felt a prickle of unease at the base of my neck, the kind of instinctual warning that tells you that you are no longer the predator in your own environment. The second man, a shorter, thicker individual with a jagged scar running through his eyebrow, didn't answer me. Instead, he walked past me to the front door, reached out a gloved hand, and turned the deadbolt with a slow, deliberate click. Then, he slid the security chain into place and leaned his back against the wood, crossing his arms over his chest in a way that made it very clear that no one was leaving this house until they were finished. "We do things a little differently here," the tall one said, reaching into his duffel bag and pulling out a heavy, motorized industrial drill instead of a spray bottle. "We heard you have a very specific collection of gold coins in that floor safe, and we would hate to leave this house without making sure they were properly cleaned." My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, and I realized with a sickening jolt that this wasn't a cleaning service at all. They had used the flyer to scout the neighborhood, and they had chosen me because I lived alone at the end of a long, dark cul-de-sac where the neighbors didn't look out their windows after 10 o'clock. "I don't know what you're talking about," I lied, my hands beginning to shake so badly that I had to tuck them into my pockets. "There is nothing in that safe but old tax documents and some family photos. Please, just take my wallet and my car keys and go." The man with the drill laughed, a dry, hollow sound that made the hair on my arms stand up. He walked into my office and kicked the rug aside, revealing the metal lid of the safe that I had thought was so well hidden. We aren't here for the car, and we aren't here for the wallet. We are here for the contents of this box, and since you're the one with the combination, you're going to make this very easy for us." He pointed the drill toward my face, the long silver bit spinning with a high-pitched whine that set my teeth on edge. "Every time I count to 3, if I don't have a number, I'm going to start with the furniture. And when the furniture is ruined, I'm going to start on you." I was backed into the corner of my own kitchen, the cold marble of the countertop pressing into my spine. I knew that if I gave them the combination, I would become a witness they couldn't afford to leave behind. They didn't have masks on. They didn't care if I saw their faces, which is the most terrifying realization you can have during a home invasion. It means they don't plan on you ever identifying them to a jury. "One," the man said, his eyes cold and fixed on mine. I looked around the kitchen, my mind racing through 1,000 different scenarios, none of which ended with me being safe. My eyes landed on a large, industrial-sized bottle of bleach I had left on the counter for the cleaners to use. It was sitting right next to a spray bottle of ammonia-based glass cleaner. My father had been a chemist, and he had warned me 1,000 times never to mix the two, because the resulting gas was lethal. "Two," he growled, stepping closer. The drill bit inches from my chest. Okay, I'll give it to you," I shouted, holding my hands up in a gesture of surrender. "But the combination is written down in the pantry. I can't remember the last 2 digits without the paper. Just let me get the paper." The man with the scar by the door nodded to his partner, and the man with the drill stepped back just enough to let me move. I stumbled into the pantry, my breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps. I grabbed the bottle of bleach and the ammonia, and with a hand that was surprisingly steady, I poured both into a large plastic bucket I kept for mopping. The reaction was almost instantaneous. A sharp, acrid smell began to rise from the bucket, a burning sensation that hit the back of my throat and made my eyes water immediately. I pulled my shirt up over my nose and mouth, holding my breath until my lungs burned. I didn't wait for the cloud to spread. I kicked the bucket out into the kitchen, sending the bubbling, toxic liquid sliding across the hardwood floor toward the 2 men. "What the hell is that?" the tall one screamed, coughing as the chlorine gas hit his lungs. He dropped the drill, his hands flying to his throat as he buckled over, gasping for air that was no longer there. The man by the door tried to move, but the floor was slick with the chemicals, and he went down hard on his back, inhaling a deep lungful of the fumes. The room began to fill with a hazy, yellowish mist that stung like 1,000 needles. I didn't wait to see if they would get up. I scrambled through the back of the pantry where there was a small laundry chute that led to the basement. It was a tight squeeze, the wooden edges scratching my shoulders and hips, but I forced myself through, sliding down the metal tunnel and landing on a pile of soft towels in the dark basement below. I knew the basement had a small, street-level window that was used for ventilation. I grabbed a heavy wrench from my workbench and smashed the glass, not caring about the noise or the shards that sliced into my palms. I pulled myself up and out, crawling through the damp dirt of the flower bed and sprinting toward the street. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, where I flagged down a passing taxi, my face white and my clothes smelling of death and chemicals. When the police arrived with the hazmat team, they found the 2 men unconscious on my living room floor, their lungs scorched by the gas they had forced me to create. The cleaning service turned out to be a pair of ex-convicts who had stolen the identity of a legitimate business to gain entry into high-end homes. They had my gold, and they had my combination, but they hadn't accounted for the fact that a victim with nothing to lose is the most dangerous person in the room. I still keep my house clean, but I do it myself now. And every time I smell the scent of bleach, I don't think of a clean home. I think of the night I had to poison my own air just to stay alive. The storm had been brewing for hours, a low, ominous rumble that felt like it was vibrating in the very marrow of my bones. I was sitting in my living room, the only light coming from a small reading lamp, while the wind howled outside like a wounded animal clawing at the siding of my house. Then, without a flicker of warning, the world went pitch black. The hum of the refrigerator, the whir of the ceiling fan, and the comforting glow of the hallway light all vanished in a single heartbeat, leaving me in a silence so thick I could almost taste it. I sat there for a moment, waiting for my eyes to adjust to the gloom, and that was when I saw him. A flash of lightning illuminated the backyard for a split second, and in that burst of jagged white light, I saw a man standing perfectly still near the electrical box by the fence. He wasn't moving toward the house, and he wasn't trying to hide. He was simply standing there, holding a pair of heavy-duty industrial wire cutters that glinted like silver teeth in the rain. My heart did a slow, painful roll in my chest as I realized this wasn't a weather-related blackout. He had waited for the storm to provide cover, and then he had systematically cut the main power lines to my home. I backed away from the window, my hands fumbling in the dark for my phone, but when I found it, the screen showed no service. He hadn't just cut the power. He had brought a signal jammer, a small device that turned my modern sanctuary into a silent, isolated tomb. I heard a low, mechanical hum start up from the side of the house, and for a moment, I felt a surge of relief. My backup generator had detected the power loss and was kicking in, providing a small stream of electricity to the emergency lights and the electronic locks on the doors. But as the lights flickered to life, I saw the man in the backyard smile, a slow, terrifying expression that told me this was exactly what he wanted. He knew that a generator only has a small tank of fuel, and he knew that as long as that engine was running, I would stay inside, thinking I was safe behind my high-tech security system. I watched him from the shadows of the kitchen, my breath hitching as he pulled a lawn chair from my patio and sat down, casually watching the house as if he were waiting for a show to begin. He wasn't in a rush. He knew the math. He knew that in exactly 2 hours the generator would sputter and die, and when it did, the electronic bolts on my front and back doors would automatically retract for safety reasons. He was waiting for the house to unlock itself for him. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead as I looked at the clock on the microwave, the red numbers ticking down the minutes of my survival. I had to get out, but the moment I stepped onto the porch, he would be on me, and I had no idea if he was alone or if there were others lurking in the tree line. I crept into the basement, hoping to find the manual override for the locks, but the darkness down there was absolute, smelling of damp earth and old boxes. I found my heavy toolbox and pulled out a long, rusted crowbar, the weight of the iron giving me a small, desperate sense of agency in a situation where I felt like a ghost. Every time the lightning struck, I could see him through the small basement window. He was checking his watch, his movements calm and rhythmic, as if he were a professional waiting for a bus instead of a monster waiting to commit a crime. The sound of the generator outside began to change, the steady roar shifting into a jagged, uneven cough that signaled the fuel was almost gone. I knew I had less than 5 minutes before the click of the locks echoed through the house, acting as a dinner bell for the man in the rain. I realized then that I couldn't run away through the yard because he was too fast and I was too visible. I had to make him come to me on my own terms. I gathered 3 large cans of gasoline that I kept for the lawnmower and began pouring them in a wide circle around the base of the basement stairs, the pungent, chemical smell filling the air until it made my head swim. I grabbed a box of long-reach matches from the laundry room shelf and stood at the top of the stairs, my finger hovering over the latch of the basement door. The generator gave one final, violent shudder and then fell silent, the sudden absence of noise feeling like a physical blow to my ears. A second later, I heard it. Click, click, click. The electronic locks in the house all disengaged at once, the sound of the metal tongues sliding back into the doors sounding like the hammers of a dozen guns being cocked. I heard the back door creak open, the wet squelch of his boots on the linoleum making my skin crawl with 1,000 invisible insects. He didn't run. He walked with the confidence of a man who had already won. I heard him move through the kitchen, then the living room, his footsteps heavy and deliberate as he searched for his prize. "I know you're tired of sitting in the dark," he called out, his voice a smooth, terrifying baritone that sounded almost like a friend's. "Why don't you come out now, and we can make this quick? I only want what's in the safe upstairs, and then I'll be on my way." I didn't answer. I stayed at the top of the basement stairs, my heart beating so hard I thought it would burst through my ribs. I heard him approach the basement door, his hand gripping the knob and turning it slowly. As the door swung open, the smell of the gasoline hit him, and for the first time, I saw hesitation in his eyes. He shined his flashlight down into the pit of the basement, the beam reflecting off the shimmering pools of fuel on the concrete floor. "You're crazy?" he whispered, stepping back, but I was faster. I struck the match, the small flame flaring into life and casting a golden glow on my face, and I dropped it into the dark. The basement erupted in a wall of orange fire, a roar of heat and light that sent a shockwave through the house. The man screamed, shielding his face from the blast, and in that moment of absolute chaos and blinding light, he did exactly what I hoped he would do. He turned and ran for the exit to escape the heat. I didn't follow him toward the fire. I ran toward the front of the house, grabbed my heavy crowbar, and smashed the front window, leaping out onto the wet grass and rolling into the shadows of the bushes. I didn't stop to look back at the flames licking the siding of my home. I sprinted toward the neighbor's house, screaming for help at the top of my lungs, my voice tearing through the sound of the rain. The fire department arrived just as the man was trying to pull his van out of the driveway, his eyebrows singed and his clothes smoking from the heat of the blast. The police blocked the end of the street, their real sirens drowning out the fading thunder of the storm. They found out later that he was part of a group that targeted homes with high-end generators, knowing exactly how to wait out the clock until the security systems failed. I lost the house that night, the fire causing too much damage to the structure to be saved, but as I sat in the back of the ambulance with a blanket around my shoulders, I realized that a house is just wood and glass. The man had tried to use the darkness and the clock to break me, but he had forgotten that fire provides its own light. Now, whenever the power goes out, I don't wait for a generator to save me. I keep a bag packed by the door, and I remember that the most dangerous thing in a dark house isn't the man outside, but the person inside who refuses to be a victim. I should have known that leaving my front door open to the public was a mistake, even if it was only for a few hours on a Sunday afternoon. My house had been on the market for 3 weeks, and the constant stream of strangers walking through my hallways, touching my countertops, and peering into my closets had started to make my skin crawl. I was supposed to be at my sister's house during the open house event, but a sudden, splitting migraine had forced me to return home early and hide in the only place the real estate agent promised not to show, the unfinished storage room in the far corner of the basement. I sat there in the dark, huddled on an old beanbag chair with a blanket over my head, listening to the muffled sound of footsteps above me as dozens of people paced through my life. By 4 o'clock, I heard the agent, Sarah, calling out a final thank you to the last group and the heavy thud of the front door closing for the day. I heard the distinct jingle of her keys and the beep of the alarm system being armed, followed by the silence that usually signaled I was finally alone again. I waited 10 minutes to be sure, my head still throbbing, before I stood up and stretched my aching limbs. I moved toward the basement stairs, but as my foot hit the first wooden step, I heard a sound that made my entire body lock into a state of frozen terror. It was the sound of a kitchen drawer being opened directly above me. A slow, grinding slide of wood on wood that I knew by heart. Sarah had armed the alarm, which meant that whoever was in my kitchen had never left the house in the first place. They had stayed behind, hiding in a closet or under a bed while the agent did her final sweep, and now they were inside the perimeter of my security system with me. I stood there in the shadows of the stairwell, my heart hammering against my ribs so loudly I was sure they could hear it through the floorboards. I waited, breathless, and then I heard the sound of metal clinking, the unmistakable noise of my chef's knives being pulled from the magnetic strip one by one and laid out on the granite island. "I know you didn't leave," a voice whispered, and it was so close to the basement door that I felt the vibration of it in my teeth. It wasn't a loud shout. It was a calm, conversational tone that suggested the person had been watching me through the cracks in the storage room door the entire time. "I saw you through the vent when I was checking the HVAC system. You look much smaller in person than you do in the photos on the mantle." The realization hit me like a physical blow. This person hadn't come to buy a house. They had come to hunt the person living inside of it. I backed away from the stairs, moving as silently as a ghost, and retreated into the depths of the basement. My mind was a frantic blur of panic, searching for an exit, but the only windows in the basement were small, decorative glass blocks that were impossible to break or squeeze through. I was trapped in a concrete box, and the only way out was through the man with the knives. I heard him start to descend the stairs, the old wood groaning under his weight with a rhythmic, agonizing slowness. He was playing with me, dragging out the moment of confrontation because he knew I had nowhere to run. I looked around the storage room and found my old gym bag, and inside, a heavy metal dumbbell that I had stopped using months ago. It wasn't much, but it was solid iron, and it was the only thing I had that could stop a man who was systematically choosing which of my own kitchen tools to use against me. "The agent really should have checked the basement more thoroughly," he said, his voice getting louder as he reached the bottom of the landing. I could see the glow of his flashlight sweeping across the dusty floor, the beam cutting through the darkness like a searchlight. But people are so careless these days. They open their doors to everyone and then act surprised when the wrong person walks in and decides to stay. I moved behind a stack of cardboard boxes, my fingers gripping the cold metal of the dumbbell until my knuckles turned white. I watched through a gap in the boxes as he stepped into the main basement area. He was wearing a clean, expensive-looking suit, the kind of outfit that allowed him to blend in perfectly with the other prospective buyers. But his eyes were wide and frantic, filled with a terrifying, manic energy. In his right hand, he held my longest carving knife, the blade catching the stray light from the small windows above. "Come out! Come out!" he crooned, kicking over a stack of old magazines and sending them fluttering across the floor. "I've spent the last hour looking through your mail and your medicine cabinet. I feel like I know you so well already. It would be a shame to end such a beautiful friendship in the dark." He was only 5 feet away from my hiding spot now, the smell of his expensive cologne mixing with the scent of damp concrete and old paper. I knew that if I stayed hidden, he would eventually find me and I would be cornered like an animal. I had to use the one advantage I had, the fact that he thought I was a helpless, cowering victim. I reached out and pushed a heavy box of books over with my foot, creating a loud crash in the opposite corner of the room. As he lunged toward the sound, his back turned to me for a split second. I stepped out from the shadows. I didn't scream and I didn't hesitate. I swung the 10-pound iron dumbbell with every ounce of strength I possessed, aiming for the back of his head. The impact was sickeningly solid, a dull thud that echoed through the empty basement, and the man collapsed forward, the carving knife clattering across the floor as he hit the concrete face first. He wasn't dead, but he was out cold, his body twitching slightly as he lay among the ruins of my stored memories. I didn't wait to see if he would wake up. I grabbed the knife he had dropped and sprinted up the stairs, my legs feeling like lead as I reached the kitchen. I didn't bother with the alarm. I smashed through the front door, the sirens finally erupting into a deafening, beautiful scream as the motion sensors triggered the police dispatch. I ran into the middle of the street, waving my arms at a neighbor who was pulling into their driveway, and I didn't stop shaking until the flashing lights of 3 patrol cars filled the cul-de-sac. When the police went into the basement, they found more than just the man in the suit. Inside his breast pocket, they found a set of floor plans for 3 other houses in the neighborhood, all of which had held open houses that same weekend. He had been collecting more than just information. He had been marking his territory, planning to return to each one once the families went to sleep. The agent apologized profusely, the real estate company offered me a settlement, and the house was pulled off the market the very next day. But the damage was already done. Now, when I walk through my home, I don't see the beautiful crown molding or the hardwood floors. I see the places where a person could hide, and I see the drawers that can be opened by a stranger's hand. I sold the house to a developer who tore it down, and I moved into a place where the doors stay locked, the windows stay shut, and I never ever invite the world to come inside and take a look around. My neighbor, Mr. Henderson, was the kind of man who kept his lawn trimmed to the exact same height every week and always waved with a stiff, polite smile from across the driveway. We weren't close, but when he knocked on my door at dusk, looking frazzled and holding a leash, I didn't think twice about helping him. He told me he had an emergency at the hospital and asked if I could watch his golden retriever, Buster, for just a few hours until his son could drive into town. He handed me a spare key and told me the dog was already in the kitchen, but he was acting skittish because of the wind. I took the key, watched him drive away in a hurry, and walked across the dark gap between our houses, never suspecting that the man I had just spoken to wasn't Mr. Henderson at all. The moment I stepped inside his house, I felt a wave of cold air that shouldn't have been there, as if a window had been left wide open to the night. The house was silent, but it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the kind of heavy, expectant quiet that happens right before a predator strikes. I called out for the dog, but there was no jingling of a collar and no sound of paws on the tile. I walked into the kitchen, my footsteps echoing in the empty space, and that was when I saw it. A single piece of notebook paper pinned to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a bone. The note was written in a jagged, trembling hand that looked nothing like the neat print on Mr. Henderson's holiday cards. It said, "If you are reading this, he is already inside. He took my clothes. He took my keys. Do not make a sound, or he will hear you from the basement." My heart stopped, a cold weight settling in my stomach as I realized the man on my porch had been wearing Mr. Henderson's signature tan windbreaker and driving his car, but his face had been obscured by the shadows of the porch light. I turned to run back to the front door, but as I reached the hallway, I heard a heavy, metallic thud from the top of the basement stairs. It was the sound of a deadbolt being slid into place, locking me inside the house from the outside. "He's a good dog, isn't he?" A voice whispered, but it didn't come from the basement. It came from the darkened living room, right behind the heavy velvet curtains. I froze, my hand hovering over the doorknob that wouldn't turn. I realized with a surge of terror that the man hadn't driven away to the hospital. He had looped around the block, parked in the alley, and let himself back into the house through the rear entrance while I was reading the note. He had lured me here to be a witness, or perhaps just to have someone to play with in the dark. "Mr. Henderson is resting," the voice continued, and a man stepped out from behind the curtains. He was still wearing the tan windbreaker, but now that I was close, I could see that it was splattered with dark, wet stains that looked almost black in the moonlight. He wasn't holding a leash anymore. He was holding a long, serrated hunting knife that he was using to absent-mindedly pick at his fingernails. He was very helpful. He told me all about his nice neighbor who always helps out with favors. He said you were the reliable type. I backed away from him, my mind screaming at me to find a weapon, but the house was a maze of antique furniture and heavy shadows. I retreated into the kitchen, my eyes searching for a way out, but the windows were all painted shut from years of neglect. I grabbed a heavy glass blender from the counter, holding the base like a club, but I knew it was a pathetic defense against a man who had already taken out someone as strong as Mr. Henderson. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, my voice trembling so much I could barely get the words out. I was trying to keep him talking, hoping that a neighbor would see the lights or that the police would pass by on a routine patrol. The man smiled, and it was a wide, empty expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Some people collect coins and some people collect stamps. I collect the moments when people realize that their safety was just an illusion. I love the look in your eyes right now. It's so much more honest than the wave you give across the driveway every morning." He began to move toward me, his boots clicking on the linoleum with a terrifying rhythm. He wasn't running. He was savoring the distance, closing the gap inch by inch. I looked at the basement door and remembered the note. If the real Mr. Henderson was down there, maybe there was another way out through the cellar door that led to the backyard. I threw the blender at the man's head, not waiting to see if it hit, and I threw my weight against the basement door, kicking at the frame until the wood splintered and the lock gave way. I tumbled down the wooden stairs, falling into the damp, smelling darkness of the cellar. I heard him laughing above me, the sound of his boots hitting the first step as he followed me down. "There's no light down there," he shouted, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "I took the bulbs out an hour ago." I scrambled across the dirt floor, my hands brushing against something cold and soft. A pile of old rugs that smelled like copper and wet fur. I reached the back corner where I knew the storm cellar doors were located, but they were padlocked from the outside. I was trapped in a hole with a madman, and the only thing I had was the darkness. But then, I felt a wet nose press against my hand. Buster, the golden retriever, was whimpering in the corner, his leash tied to a heavy iron pipe. I didn't think. I reached out and unclipped the leash from the pipe, but I didn't hold on to it. I grabbed a heavy garden spade from a nearby shelf and whispered a command I had seen Mr. Henderson use 1,000 times. "Buster, protect." The dog, usually the friendliest creature in the neighborhood, let out a low, guttural growl that sounded like a chainsaw starting up. As the intruder reached the bottom of the stairs, his flashlight beam cutting through the dust, the dog launched himself forward. The man screamed as 80 pounds of muscle and teeth slammed into his chest, knocking him backward onto the hard dirt. I didn't wait for the fight to end. I used the garden spade to smash the hinges of the cellar door, swinging the heavy metal tool with a strength fueled by pure, unadulterated survival instinct. The wood groaned and snapped, and I crawled out into the night air, the rain hitting my face like a blessing. I ran to my house, locked every door, and called the police while Buster's barking continued to echo from the house next door. When the authorities arrived, they found the intruder pinned in the corner of the basement, his tan windbreaker torn to shreds and his knife lying out of reach. Mr. Henderson was found alive, tied up in the coal room, bruised but breathing. The man had been an escaped patient from a nearby facility who had a fixation on replacing people in quiet neighborhoods. I still live in that house, and I still wave to Mr. Henderson every morning, but I never go over for favors anymore, and I never, ever step inside a house unless I can see the face of the person inviting me in. Because now I know that sometimes the person waving from across the street isn't your neighbor at all. They are just someone wearing his clothes, waiting for you to walk through the door. The first time it happened, I convinced myself it was just a simple electrical interference from a neighbor's new remote or perhaps a rogue signal from a passing plane. It was 3 o'clock in the morning, and the sudden, heavy mechanical groan of my garage door opening echoed through the silent house like a waking giant. I sat up in bed, my heart thumping against my ribs, and watched from my window as the heavy metal door slid upward, revealing the empty driveway to the cold, moonlit street. I used my phone app to close it, watching the door descend back into place, and I went back to sleep thinking it was nothing more than a ghost in the machine. But on the second night, it happened again at exactly the same time, and on the third night, the door didn't just open. It began to cycle, opening and closing in a rhythmic, taunting loop that lasted for 10 minutes straight. I called a technician on the fourth day, a man who spent 3 hours poking at the wiring and testing the sensors only to tell me that everything was in perfect working order. He suggested that someone might be code grabbing, using a device to record my remote's frequency, and he advised me to unplug the motor before I went to bed. I followed his advice, feeling a sense of relief as I pulled the heavy black plug from the ceiling outlet, believing that a machine without power could no longer be used against me. But that night, as I sat in my darkened living room with a baseball bat across my knees, I realized that the garage door was never the intended entrance. It was a metronome, a tool used to measure how long it took for me to react. At exactly 3 a.m., the silence of the house was broken not by the sound of the garage motor, but by a soft, rhythmic thudding coming from directly above my head. It sounded like footsteps, but they weren't on the floorboards. They were on the shingles of the roof, moving with a light, practiced grace that made my skin crawl. I realized then that the garage door glitches had been a distraction to keep my eyes fixed on the ground level while someone was mapping out the access points on my second story. I stood up, my legs feeling like water, and I crept toward the hallway just as I heard the unmistakable sound of a window being pried open in the guest bedroom. I didn't have time to run to the front door, and I knew that if I headed for the stairs, I would be walking right into whoever was coming through that window. I ducked into the laundry room, which sat directly behind the garage, and and I realized with a surge of panic that I had left the internal door to the garage unlocked after the technician left. I was trapped in a small, windowless utility space with only two ways out, and both of them led to a confrontation with a person who had spent a week studying my habits from the shadows. I reached up and fumbled for the light switch, but I stopped myself just in time, realizing that the glow under the door would be a beacon for the intruder. I heard the guest bedroom door creak open, followed by the heavy, deliberate sound of boots on the hardwood. "I know you unplugged the motor," a voice whispered, and it sounded distorted, as if the speaker were wearing a thick mask or speaking through a device. "It was a smart move, but you should have spent more time looking at your skylights and less time looking at your driveway. You've been so focused on the door that you forgot to look up." The footsteps began to descend the stairs, each creak of the wood sounding like a countdown to my own end. I looked around the laundry room, my eyes searching for anything that could be used as a weapon, and my gaze landed on the heavy-duty gallon of industrial drain cleaner I had bought to fix the sink. It was a caustic, terrifying chemical, and the warning label was covered in skull and crossbones icons that seemed to glow in the dim moonlight filtering through the vents. I grabbed the bottle, my fingers shaking so violently that the plastic crinkled loudly in the silence of the room. The intruder reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped, the silence stretching out for what felt like an eternity. I could hear him breathing, a slow, ragged sound that suggested he was savoring the hunt, enjoying the fact that he had turned my own home into a labyrinth where he held all the maps. He began to walk toward the laundry room, his shadow stretching across the floor as he passed the single nightlight I kept in the hallway. "You have 30 seconds to come out and tell me where you keep the emergency cash," he said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "If I have to find you, the price of my departure is going to go up significantly. I've been watching you for 7 days, and I know exactly which corner you like to hide in when you're scared." I didn't answer. I moved to the side of the laundry room door, holding the bottle of drain cleaner with the cap loosened, my heart hammering so hard I thought it would burst through my chest. As the door handle began to turn, I didn't wait for him to step inside. I kicked the door open with all my strength, catching him off guard as the heavy wood slammed into his shoulder. Before he could recover, I lunged forward and threw the contents of the bottle toward his face, aiming for the slits in the dark tactical mask he was wearing. The man let out a high-pitched, gurgling scream as the chemicals hit him, and he dropped the heavy crowbar he was carrying, his hands flying to his eyes as he stumbled back into the kitchen. I didn't stay to see the damage. I bolted past him, my feet skidding on the tile as I raced toward the internal garage door. I threw myself inside the darkened garage, and in the chaos, I forgot that the motor was still unplugged. I grabbed the manual release cord, the red plastic handle slick with my own sweat, and I yanked it down with a desperate prayer. I threw my weight against the garage door, heaving the heavy metal slabs upward by hand. It was slow, agonizing work, and I could hear the man behind me, his screams turning into a low, wet sobbing as he tried to find his way toward me in his blinded state. I managed to get the door open just high enough to roll under it, my body hitting the cold concrete of the driveway as I scrambled toward the street. I didn't look back until I reached the safety of a neighbor's porch, where I pounded on the door and screamed for someone to call the police. When the authorities arrived, they found the man collapsed in my kitchen, his face severely burned and his tactical gear covered in the white, bubbling residue of the cleaner. They found a sophisticated signal jamming device in his pocket, along with a high-definition camera that he had mounted to the tree overlooking my bedroom window. He had been a former employee of the security company I had used to install the system, and he knew exactly how to exploit the glitch in the garage door to create a sense of psychological fatigue before he made his move. I sold that house a month later, unable to look at the garage or the roof without feeling a cold shiver of terror. I live in a condo now, high above the ground where the only way in is through a reinforced door and a lobby full of cameras. But every night at 3 a.m., I still find myself waking up, my eyes fixed on the ceiling, listening for the sound of footsteps on the shingles and the groan of a door that refuses to stay closed. I have always been the kind of person who finds comfort in the small, digital connections of the modern world. especially on those long, lonely nights when the silence of my house feels a little too heavy to bear. It was a Thursday evening, and I was sitting on my plush velvet sofa, the only light in the room coming from the soft, warm glow of a floor lamp and the bright screen of my smartphone. I felt a sudden burst of confidence, a desire to share a moment of my quiet life with a friend. So I raised my phone to take a quick selfie to send as a playful update. I smiled at the lens. The shutter clicked with a tiny, artificial sound, and I pulled the phone back to check the image before hitting send. My blood turned to ice in a single, agonizing second, because in the dark reflection of the glass sliding door directly behind me, there was a face that didn't belong in my home. It wasn't a blurry shape or a trick of the light. It was a man with a pale, gaunt face and eyes that looked like two hollow pits of charcoal, staring directly into the back of my head from the darkness of the patio. I sat perfectly still, my heart hammering against my ribs so violently that I could feel the pulse in my fingertips, and I realized with a sickening jolt that he wasn't outside at all. The reflection was too sharp, the details of his jagged, yellow teeth too clear, which meant he was standing inside the house, just inches away from the sofa where I Saturday. I didn't turn around. I knew that the moment I broke the visual contact through the screen, the game would be over and the violence would begin. "That's a very nice photo," a voice whispered, and it was so close that I could feel the moisture of his breath on the fine hairs at the nape of my neck. The sound was a dry, raspy wheeze, like wind blowing through dead leaves, and it carried a scent of stale tobacco and old, damp earth. "You should send it. It's the last time anyone is going to see you looking quite so peaceful." I watched him through the reflection on my phone screen, my hands trembling so much that the image began to blur and shake. He was holding a heavy, rusted pair of garden shears, the blades half open like the beak of a predatory bird. I knew that my front door was locked and my alarm was set, but I realized then that I had left the sliding door in the kitchen unlocked for just a few minutes while I let the cat out, and that was all the time a monster needed to slip inside. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice coming out as a thin, pathetic squeak that betrayed the absolute terror vibrating through my soul. I tried to keep my eyes fixed on the phone, watching his shadow as he moved slightly to the left, his movements fluid and silent like a snake in the grass. The man laughed, a low, bubbling sound that made my skin crawl with 1,000 invisible insects. "I want to see if you look the same on the inside as you do on the outside. I've been watching you through that glass for 3 nights, waiting for you to forget the lock. You have such a predictable routine, it was almost boring to wait for the mistake. But the mistake finally came, didn't it? I knew I had to move, but my legs felt like they were made of lead and my mind was a chaotic static of panic." I looked at the reflection and saw him raising the shears, the metal reflecting the light of the lamp with a cold, indifferent shimmer. I didn't have a weapon, but I was still holding my phone, and I realized it was the only thing I had that could create a momentary distraction. I didn't turn around. Instead, I activated the high-intensity camera flash in a rapid-fire burst, the blinding white light erupting into the room like a series of miniature lightning strikes. The man let out a sharp cry of pain, his sensitive eyes, which had spent the last hour adjusting to the darkness, unable to handle the sudden, brilliant glare. He stumbled back, his hands flying to his face, and I heard the heavy shears hit the hardwood floor with a dull, metallic thud. I didn't wait to see if he was permanently blinded. I threw myself off the sofa and sprinted toward the kitchen, my socks skidding on the polished floor as I rounded the corner. I didn't head for the back door, because I knew he was between me and the exit. I dove into the small pantry, slamming the louvered door shut and sliding the manual bolt into place just as I heard his heavy boots hitting the tile behind me. He began to throw his weight against the thin wooden door, the slats groaning and splintering under the force of his rage. "You can't hide in a closet forever," he screamed, his voice no longer a whisper but a raw, jagged roar that echoed through the small space. "I'm going to cut through this wood, and then I'm going to start on you." I looked around the pantry, my eyes landing on a large glass bottle of olive oil and a box of Strike Anywhere matches I kept for the grill. It was a desperate, dangerous plan, but the door was already beginning to give way, a pale, scarred hand reaching through one of the broken slats to fumble for the bolt. I unscrewed the cap of the oil and poured it in a thick, shimmering stream under the door, soaking the floor where his boots were planted. Then, I struck 3 matches at once and dropped them into the pool of oil. The fire didn't explode, but it caught with a sudden, hungry hiss, the oil acting as a slow-burning fuel that sent a wall of heat upward. The man let out a howl of agony as the flames licked at his boots and the bottom of his trousers, and he scrambled back away from the door, his screams fading as he retreated into the living room to find water. I used the opportunity to unbolt the pantry door, the smoke stinging my eyes and making me cough as I burst out into the kitchen. I didn't look back. I ran for the front door, fumbling with the deadbolt for a heartbeat that felt like an eternity before I finally tore it open and collapsed onto the front porch. I didn't stop until I reached the street, where I flagged down a passing car and begged them to call 911. When the police arrived, the fire had already spread to the curtains, but they found the man collapsed on the patio, his legs severely burned and his eyes still red and weeping from the flash of the camera. They found a backpack in the bushes near my sliding door that contained a collection of photos he had taken of me through my windows over the last month, each one marked with the time and a chilling description of what I was doing. I moved out of that house the following week, and I haven't taken a selfie since. I live in a place now where every window has heavy, blackout curtains that are never opened after the sun goes down. But sometimes, when I see my reflection in a dark screen or a mirrored hallway, I still find myself looking over my shoulder, waiting for the pale face to appear in the glass, because I know that even when the doors are locked, the things that watch us from the darkness are never truly gone. I had only lived in the neighborhood for 2 weeks, and the moving boxes were still stacked like cardboard towers in my living room, making the house feel like a temporary camp rather than a home. It was a Tuesday night, and the street was unusually quiet, shrouded in a thick fog that seemed to swallow the light from the few functioning street lamps. I was sitting on the floor of my bedroom, sorting through a box of old books, when the first heavy blow struck my front door. It wasn't a knock, and it wasn't a greeting. It was the sound of a heavy, metal object being slammed against the wood with enough force to make the entire frame groan in protest. Before I could even stand up, a man's voice, raw with a jagged and terrifying anger, roared through the house, demanding that Miller come out and pay what was owed. My name isn't Miller, and I didn't owe anyone anything, but the men on the other side of the door didn't seem interested in my identity. "Open the door, Miller. We know you're in there, and we know you're alone because we've been watching the house since the sun went down," the voice screamed, followed by the sound of a heavy boot kicking the lower panel of the door so hard that the wood began to splinter. I realized with a surge of cold, numbing terror that these men were looking for the previous tenant, a man who had left in a hurry under circumstances my landlord had been very vague about during the signing of the lease. I was being hunted for a debt that wasn't mine, by people who didn't believe in mistakes. I ran to the window and looked out through the blinds, and my heart sank into my stomach as I saw a black SUV idling at the curb, its headlights turned off and its engine purring like a waiting beast. There were 3 of them, 2 at the door and 1 standing by the car, holding a short, heavy iron bar that he was tapping against his palm in a slow, rhythmic cadence. I fumbled for my phone, but in the chaos of the move, I had forgotten to charge it, and the screen remained a cold, mocking black as I pressed the power button in a frantic, useless prayer. "I'm not Miller. You have the wrong house. The man who lived here is gone," I shouted, my voice cracking as I leaned against the door, trying to use my own body weight to reinforce the buckling wood. The response was a short, brutal laugh from the other side. "That's a real good one, Miller. You think a new coat of paint and a change of voice is going to save you from the 20 grand you took? We're coming in, and the longer you make us wait, the worse it's going to be for you when we get our hands on you." I heard a sudden, sharp crack from the back of the house, the sound of a window being smashed in the kitchen. They were tired of the front door, and they were splitting up to surround me. I backed away from the entrance, my mind racing through the layout of the house, and I realized I was trapped in a narrow hallway with no secondary exit. I ducked into the bathroom and slid the small, pathetic privacy lock into place, knowing it wouldn't hold for more than a single kick, but it was the only room in the house with a heavy, cast-iron clawfoot tub that I could use for cover. I heard them enter the kitchen, their heavy boots crunching on the broken glass, their voices low and professional as they cleared the rooms. "He's not in the kitchen?" one of them said, and I heard the sound of my moving boxes being tossed aside, the contents spilling across the floor as they searched for a man who wasn't there. "Check the bedrooms," the leader replied, his voice getting closer. "He's cornered himself. He's got nowhere to go but out the front, and Tommy is waiting there with the bar." I crouched behind the tub, my hands over my mouth to stifle the sound of my ragged breathing, and I looked around the small bathroom for anything I could use to defend myself. My eyes landed on a heavy, gallon-sized bottle of professional-grade drain opener that I had left on the sink, along with a can of high-pressure hairspray. It wasn't much, but it was all the chemistry I had. I grabbed a towel, soaked it in the drain opener, and draped it over the top of the doorframe, wedging it so that it would fall on whoever pushed their way inside. I heard them reach the bathroom door, and the handle turned once, then twice, before the wood began to strain under the pressure of a shoulder. "Miller, don't be a coward. Come out and talk to us like a man, and maybe we won't have to leave you in the crawl space," the leader said, his voice now right on the other side of the thin panel. The door exploded inward with a single violent shove, and as I had hoped, the soaked towel fell directly onto the head and shoulders of the first man who stepped inside. He let out a choked scream as the caustic liquid hit his eyes and skin, his hands flying to his face as he stumbled back into his partner. In the confusion, I didn't wait. I grabbed the heavy porcelain lid of the toilet tank, a solid 20-pound slab of ceramic, and I lunged forward with every ounce of survival instinct I possessed. I swung the lid with a wide, desperate arc, catching the second man in the side of the head just as he was trying to push his blinded partner out of the way. There was a sickening, heavy thud, and the man went down like a sack of stones, his head hitting the tiled floor with a finality that made my stomach turn. The first man was still screaming, his hands clawing at his face as he tried to wash the chemicals away with the water from the sink. I didn't stay to finish the fight. I bolted out of the bathroom, leaping over the boxes in the hallway and racing toward the front door. I didn't care about the man with the iron bar outside. I knew that if I stayed in the house, I was dead. I tore the front door open and sprinted into the fog, my feet hitting the pavement with a frantic, rhythmic slap. The man by the SUV saw me and let out a shout, swinging the iron bar as I passed, but he was slow and I was fueled by pure, unadulterated adrenaline. I didn't head for the main road. I ran through the neighbor's yard, scaled a chain-link fence that tore my palms, and hid in the thick, overgrown bushes of a vacant lot 3 houses down. I stayed there for what felt like hours, my heart hammering against my ribs, until I finally heard the distant, beautiful wail of sirens approaching the street. The police found the 2 men in my house, one blinded and the other with a severe concussion. But the man in the SUV had vanished into the fog before the first cruiser arrived. They confirmed that the previous tenant, a man named Marcus Miller, was wanted for a string of high-stakes frauds and had skipped town just days before I moved in. The men had been hired to recover a debt, and they hadn't bothered to check if the person inside the house matched the name on the ledger. I moved out the next morning, leaving my deposit and half of my furniture behind. I didn't even go back to pack the rest of my boxes. I paid a professional crew to do it while a private security guard stood at the door. I live in a high-rise now, a place where no one knows my name and every visitor has to be buzzed in through a reinforced gate. But even now, when I hear a heavy knock on a door or a boot hitting a floorboard, I find myself reaching for the nearest heavy object, because I know that sometimes the world doesn't care who you are. It only cares about the house you're standing in.